Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There are many unsettling things in Lovecraft's universe. Cyclopean ruins, buried cults, unspeakable tomes. But the Dunwich Horror contains something darker still, an experiment. Not merely a ritual, not a summoning. An experiment that fuses mysticism and science in a catastrophic attempt to breach the fundamental architecture of reality. It fails in one sense, it succeeds in another, and we're still reckoning with its implications. In this episode, we'll investigate the most catastrophic experiment in the Dunwich Horror, the conception and near materialization of a being that was never meant to walk this earth. We'll uncover the historical influences that shaped it, from fringe 1920s science to occult traditions and New England folklore. We'll explore the philosophical core of the story, the nature of time, identity, and knowledge when warped by forces outside human comprehension. And we'll examine how this experiment continues to echo through fiction, psychology, and even modern myth. This is not a retelling. It is a forensic inquiry into the symbolic and intellectual mechanisms that make the Dunwich Horror more than a story. You'll see how Lovecraft built a trap, one we entered willingly and never quite escaped. H.P. Lovecraft wrote the Dunwich Horror in the spring of 1928, during a pivotal period of personal and creative transition. Having returned to Providence after several disillusioning years in New York, he was once again immersed in the decaying New England landscapes that shaped his early imagination. Lovecraft's return to place coincided with a return to a more structured narrative form. Unlike the fragmented epistolary horror of The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, the Dunwich Horror presents a coherent tale of cause, transgression, and consequence. But beneath its more traditional surface lies a story that is no less cosmically destabilizing. The experiment conducted by the Whateleys, fathered by Yog-Sothoth, midwifed by forbidden texts, and completed by ritual, is not just an inciting incident. It is, in Lovecraft's private notes, a proof of concept for the collapse of human boundaries. Consider this carefully. The Dunwich Horror marks the moment when Lovecraft began framing horror not merely as revelation, but as consequence. Wilbur Whateley's conception is not accidental. It is the planned outcome of a generational agenda. In this sense, Lovecraft's intent pivots sharply toward what might be called ritualized futurism, the belief that cosmic horror will be birthed through acts, not just encounters. Unlike the passive discovery of the Nameless City or the Whisperer in Darkness, this story is driven by human hands reaching outward and being taken. The timing of the story's composition is no less significant. 1928 was a year defined by scientific upheaval. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, transforming the microbial world into something simultaneously hopeful and terrifying. Physicists like Paul Dirac and Niels Bohr were deepening the foundations of quantum mechanics, introducing uncertainty, indeterminacy, and observer-dependent phenomena into what had once been a mechanistic cosmos. In the same cultural moment, Lovecraft wrote of rituals that altered time-space barriers, invisible offspring birthed from interdimensional contact, and knowledge that required not belief, but application. The parallels are not coincidental. Though Lovecraft outwardly rejected modern science in favor of classical materialism, his fiction increasingly responded to scientific motifs by pushing them into grotesque and speculative extremes. The experiment in the Dunwich Horror is framed in terms Lovecraft would have considered dangerously modern: heredity, acceleration, and transcendence. Wilbur's growth is described not as magical, but biological. His intelligence is procedural. His goals, accessing the Necronomicon, completing the ritual, opening the gate, are structured as a developmental program. In this way, Lovecraft prefigures later anxieties surrounding accelerated evolution and unauthorized technological experimentation. The Whateleys' use of ancient knowledge to engineer a post-human outcome directly mirrors contemporary fears of tampering with what ought not be touched. Not sorcery, but synthesis. Not belief, but procedure. Not chaos, but design. We must pause here to consider Lovecraft's attitude toward intention. In his letters, he frequently insisted that horror arises not from action, but from the revelation of insignificance. And yet in Dunwich, the horror is precisely what is done, what Lavinia and her father choose. This shift suggests a tension in Lovecraft's thinking. On one hand, the cosmic order is vast, indifferent, and already broken. On the other, humans possess enough agency to accelerate their own obliteration. The experiment is catastrophic, not because it fails, but because it proves that even rural madmen with a copy of the right book can access the machinery of universal structure. Knowledge is no longer forbidden because it is unreachable. It is forbidden because it works. The character of Dr. Armitage, head librarian at Miskatonic University, further reveals Lovecraft's creative pivot. Armitage is not a mystic. He is a scholar, a man of books and boundaries. His horror at the Whateleys' actions stems from his realization that the frameworks of academia have been breached from within. Miskatonic's archives, intended as a fortress of knowledge, have become the site of its misuse. This dynamic mirrors Lovecraft's own discomfort with the democratization of scientific and occult knowledge. In earlier Gothic narratives, the danger lies in hidden tomes and secret societies. In Dunwich, the Necronomicon is shelved in a university library. The veil is thin and growing thinner. Lovecraft's letters to August Derleth during this period confirm his deliberate focus on localizing horror. The Dunwich Horror was, in his own words, an experiment in developing a horror tale with a positive hero. But the narrative's true innovation lies elsewhere. It presents the idea that horror does not always arrive from beyond. Sometimes it is born among us, nurtured in plain sight, spoken into being by mothers and sons. The story's central experiment, the breeding of a cosmic entity through human womb and will, is an allegory of incubation. It suggests that the future breach will not come with noise, but with inheritance. We now turn to the deeper layers beneath this act, the symbolic traditions, mythic echoes, and philosophical antecedents that shaped the contours of the Whateleys' ritual. In short, how did we arrive at a moment when this could be considered possible? The most catastrophic experiment in the Dunwich Horror cannot be understood without examining the entities it sought to manipulate, particularly Yog-Sothoth, the being invoked, accessed, or perhaps awakened by the Whateleys. Among all of Lovecraft's entities, Yog-Sothoth occupies a singular ontological position. It is not merely a god or dimensional being, but a totality. In Lovecraft's own phrasing, Yog-Sothoth is coexistent with all time and space, suggesting omnipresence not as spatial vastness, but as epistemic saturation. It does not travel. It is the threshold. The Whateleys, by attempting contact, are not summoning a visitor. They are creating a conduit, making an aperture in the fabric of human continuity. In contrast to other mythos beings who dwell outside our cosmos, Cthulhu, slumbering beneath the sea, or Nyarlathotep, moving between avatars, Yog-Sothoth is a conceptual force given form. It represents total knowledge without filtration, the unprocessed totality of being. To invoke it is not to speak to a god, but to open the human frame to what no mind was shaped to hold. This explains why the Necronomicon describes it in linguistic paradoxes. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. The recursive syntax is not metaphor. It is ontological logic. Yog-Sothoth exists only where categories collapse. The Whateleys do not merely worship Yog-Sothoth. They participate in its unfolding. Old Whateley's intent is not sacrificial or devotional, but reproductive. He and Lavinia act as vectors for a biological rupture, embedding cosmic force within human genealogy. The result is Wilbur, a hybrid in form but not in allegiance. Wilbur's accelerated intellect, his non-human physiology, and his unblinking drive toward completion suggest that his human traits are superficial, camouflage rather than essence. He is not an emissary, he is a prototype. But the experiment extends beyond Wilbur. The invisible twin, referred to by the town as it, is the true result. Vast, unseen, incomprehensibly large, this being exists in a liminal state between dimensions. It occupies space but refuses form. Its very presence destabilizes language. Villagers speak in euphemisms, and Lovecraft relies on negative description, emphasizing absence, distortion, and echo. This is not merely a stylistic decision. It reflects the entity's nature as an incomplete incarnation of Yog-Sothoth itself. The brother is not a separate being. It is Yog-Sothoth's attempt to localize, a foothold. There are other forces at play, though less immediately visible. The Necronomicon, often misunderstood as merely a book, functions here as a ritual technology, a schema for reshaping causality. Armitage's commentary reveals that the text contains not only spells or histories, but mechanisms, ways to alter sequence, fold barriers, and impose non-human logic on human time. It is not the words that hold power, but the configurations. The book is not sacred, it is operational. The role of Miskatonic University must also be acknowledged, not as an institution of learning, but as a sealing force. Armitage, Rice, and Morgan are not protagonists in a moral sense. They are temporary repairmen. Their collective function is containment. They possess no power to destroy, only to defer. Their confrontation with the invisible being is an act of damage control. It is crucial that they do not kill it. They persuade it, speaking in the language of the old ones. This is not exorcism. It is negotiation with an intelligence that should not be addressed. We must pause here to consider a disturbing implication. Yog-Sothoth, in this story, is not malevolent. It does not seek domination or destruction. It simply responds. It is contacted, accessed, utilized. The experiment is catastrophic not because of what Yog-Sothoth does, but because of what it allows. The tragedy lies in the fact that such a force can be reached at all. Cosmic horror, in this configuration, is procedural. In this framework, other entities are forces rather than personalities. Entropy, miscegenation, hybridity, unchecked intellect. These are not characters but currents, what philosopher Eugene Thacker might call worlds without us. The Whateleys ride these currents knowingly. Armitage and the town of Dunwich, less so. But all are drawn into the gravity well of this cosmic convergence. The final force, rarely discussed but central, is the womb. Lavinia Whateley, often marginalized in analyses, is not merely a pawn. Her body is the site of the experiment. The fusion of cosmic and human cannot occur without her. That she vanishes mid-story is symbolically resonant. She is consumed by the system she helped birth. In this light, the Dunwich experiment is not just arcane, it is reproductive horror, a gestational reformatting of what life means. We will examine how these forces affect human cognition, behavior, and ultimately, sanity. The experiment may have failed in its totality, but its impact on the human mind was irreversible. The madness was not a side effect. It was the point. Language is not a passive vessel in the Dunwich Horror. It is the first threshold. Before Wilbur Whateley grows, before the invisible twin shakes the hills, before any ritual is performed, the story begins with names, sounds, and fragments, words that do not describe, but activate. Lovecraft understood that terror begins not with action, but with linguistic distortion. Words that should signify begin instead to unravel. What should clarify begins to leak. Let us begin with the name Dunwich. Though invented, it echoes real English villages. Dunwich, Suffolk, once a prosperous port swallowed by the sea, now a ghost village lost to erosion. The illusion is deliberate. The town in Lovecraft's tale is likewise eroding, not from water, but from within. Its genealogy, culture, and very speech are collapsing. Dunwich evokes a place whose foundations are slipping beneath time and visibility. Even phonetically, it is close to dunnage, excess material cast aside. The name becomes prophecy. Whateley carries similar weight. On the surface, it appears to be a simple Anglo surname. But parsed phonetically, Whatelays, it suggests absence and ambiguity. What lays? What is laid? It's a name that gestures toward obscured origins, toward something birthed but not named. Lavinia Whateley's offspring is quite literally a what. This etymological instability reinforces the story's core theme. Human categories, name, kin, form, are inadequate for what has occurred. The story is saturated with linguistic paradoxes. None more famous than Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. This is not poetic flourish. It is recursive syntax functioning as metaphysical logic. Yog-Sothoth is not a subject acting through time. It is simultaneity personified. By identifying gate, key, and guardian as one, Lovecraft dismantles linear process. Access is indistinguishable from destination. Speech becomes non-directional. Such phrasing creates a linguistic event horizon. The more closely one tries to parse the statement, the more quickly language collapses into itself. This recursive paradox is not accidental. Lovecraft wrote elsewhere that cosmic truths could not be communicated directly. Instead, they manifest through semiotic decay, when words no longer point cleanly to meaning. In the Dunwich Horror, this decay is embedded in every ritual phrase and descriptive passage. The incantations used by Wilbur and his grandfather are described but never transcribed in full, as though their very repetition would function. This is symbolic language not as metaphor, but as operating code. Even physical descriptions become unstable. Wilbur's physiognomy is conveyed through metaphor and negation. Goatish, curiously elongated, repellently non-human. The most direct attempts to describe his corpse involve anatomical impossibilities. Eyes in the hips, limbs arranged contrary to known biology. These aren't merely grotesque details. They signal a failure of taxonomic language. When confronted with that which transcends category, the tools of classification become corrosive. Lavinia's prayers to Yog-Sothoth follow the same pattern. They are described secondhand, translated through fearful neighbors, or filtered through hearsay. This distancing is critical. It places the ritual not in the realm of performance, but in the realm of transmission. Her words, like the Necronomicon's passages, are never offered plainly. They are spoken of, but not spoken. This indirectness suggests that language itself is not a medium of control, but a medium of contagion. To speak certain words is to cross a line. We must pause to consider the Necronomicon here. In Dunwich, it is more than a plot device. It is a semiotic virus, a book whose phrases are not interpreted, but activated. Unlike traditional grimoires, which often catalog spells and rituals in exhaustive detail, the Necronomicon is described in fragments. Sentences are torn from context. Phrases are cited like scripture. This modular presentation reinforces the sense that meaning lies not in the whole, but in the phrase itself. A line can open a gate. Even the spoken word is treated as an event. When Wilbur dies, his attempt to finish the incantation fails not because the words are incorrect, but because the pronunciation is corrupted. His voice becomes less than human. The effect is twofold. The spell fails, and the language itself betrays him. The voice, the most human instrument, is incompatible with the entity it seeks to invoke. The collapse is both magical and linguistic. Finally, the invisible twin's speech at the climax deserves attention. It does not roar or shriek. It speaks, and it speaks in clear, articulate English. Father, I never heard anyone speak, so before, I heard it inside my head. This moment is quietly devastating. The being does not communicate through divine tongues or unearthly vibration. It uses language, intimate and internal, bypassing ears entirely. Its voice is intrapsychic. This reveals a terrifying evolution. The experiment has moved from external ritual to internal inscription. It does not need to be summoned. It now inhabits. We now approach a deeper layer still. How Lovecraft uses these symbolic disruptions not as ornamentation, but to build myth. In the next section, we will examine how the Dunwich Horror achieves authenticity, not despite its fabrications, but because of them. When lies echo truth, the myth becomes inevitable. One of Lovecraft's most enduring achievements in the Dunwich Horror lies not in what he invents, but in how he convinces us it has always existed. The story's power emerges from the seamless fusion of fabrication and framework. Its ability to construct a believable mythology through borrowed forms, institutional settings, and false documentation. Lovecraft doesn't ask the reader to suspend disbelief. He displaces it. He replaces the boundaries of fiction with the architecture of academic realism. At the heart of this method is what literary scholars now refer to as mythopoiesis, the conscious creation of myth through layered narrative strategies. In the Dunwich Horror, Lovecraft develops a synthetic mythology that feels pre-existing by embedding it within the trappings of credible knowledge. Consider the first tool, the academic narrator. Dr. Armitage and his colleagues do not speak like characters in a horror story. They operate within the linguistic register of institutional science, cautious, precise, and evidentiary. Armitage's reports, citations, and deliberations mimic real scholarly analysis. This scholarly tone disarms the reader, presenting the unbelievable as bureaucratically processed. The horror is domesticated by the very systems meant to contain it. Lovecraft deepens this illusion by drawing on institutional credibility. Miskatonic University, though entirely fictional, is presented with such consistency across stories, library archives, faculty names, architectural details, that it accrues the weight of real-world continuity. By situating the Necronomicon in its library, Lovecraft converts the arcane into the academic. The grimoire is not locked in a crypt or guarded by cultists. It's cataloged, indexed, and consulted. This unexpected placement grants the book a chilling normality. The forbidden, now accessible, is made more dangerous, not less. The Necronomicon itself is a masterclass in synthetic authenticity. Lovecraft repeatedly references its author, the Mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, its partial translations by Olaus Wormius, and its suppressed printings under the Vatican Index. These details are not elaborated. They are alluded to, like well-known scholarly trivia. This technique, borrowed from biblical apocrypha and Masonic lore, creates what might be called implied legitimacy. The text's authority is built not on explanation, but on its embeddedness in a wider and imaginary textual tradition. We must pause here to consider a structural device Lovecraft employs with cunning effect, the nested narrative. The events of the Dunwich Horror are not told in real time. They are recounted through newspaper reports, eyewitness testimonies, faculty transcripts, and regional folklore. Each layer refracts the truth slightly differently. This fragmentation is not a limitation. It is a design, allowing the myth to echo through multiple registers. The reader is not asked to believe one perspective. They are asked to reconcile many. The horror grows not from what is shown, but from the gaps between versions. Equally crucial is Lovecraft's manipulation of geographical realism. While Dunwich is fictional, it is constructed from specific regional details: New England topography, colonial graveyards, Puritan ruins, and decaying farmsteads. The precision with which Lovecraft evokes these landscapes, intermittent hills, weathered barns, eroded paths, creates the sense that this place could be found just off the map. This technique roots the myth in a liminal American setting, one foot in the present, the other in some pre-modern substrate. The uncanny arises not from alien geometry, but from the familiar made slightly off. A collapsing barn becomes a mouth. A hill becomes a hiding place for a god's son. The inclusion of folklore motifs adds another layer. References to devil's hop yards, black mischief, and weird cries on Walpurgis night tie the story to pre-existing superstitions. But Lovecraft's genius lies in inverting causality. He suggests that local folklore is residual evidence of older cosmic truths. The villagers are not irrational. They are correct in ways they cannot comprehend. This repositions folklore not as superstition, but as a degraded memory of catastrophic contact. Myth here is not constructed. It is excavated. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft never offers a definitive account of what Yog-Sothoth is. The being remains linguistically and ontologically unstable. And yet, the rituals surrounding it, the gate, the key, the breeding, are described with chilling certainty. The myth is not about Yog-Sothoth's nature, but about its consequences. Myth here functions not to explain the universe, but to mark where it broke. Narrative authenticity arises from this asymmetry. The event is known, the meaning is not. Finally, we must address Lovecraft's refusal to resolve. The Dunwich Horror ends with temporary containment, not triumph. The invisible child speaks, the hills fall silent, but no permanent victory is declared. Armitage himself seems shaken, not reassured. This absence of closure is vital. In real-world myth, meaning is never final. It shifts, decays, resurfaces. Lovecraft mirrors this by designing a mythic structure that never ends. The story remains open, unstable, and transmissible. We shift from how myth is constructed to what it means. What ideas, fears, and worldviews animate the Dunwich experiment? What conceptual horror drives a man to offer his daughter to a god that is time itself? We now begin our descent into the philosophical. The experiment at the center of the Dunwich Horror is not only catastrophic because of what it unleashes, it is catastrophic because of what it proves. It demonstrates, through action rather than theory, that human significance, causality, and perception are illusions maintained only by our ignorance. The Whateley's ritual does not disrupt the natural order. It reveals that there is no natural order, only a temporary consensus reality, easily overwritten. The horror is not invasion. It is discovery. At the heart of Lovecraft's philosophical project is insignificance. In the Dunwich Horror, this theme evolves beyond insignificance in scale, the human versus the cosmic, into ontological irrelevance. Wilbur and his brother are not products of a world gone wrong. They are reminders that the world has never been right. The experiment does not shatter the boundaries of reality. It shows that those boundaries are permeable, conditional, and built on false assumptions. The very act of trying the ritual proves it was always possible. That is the true desecration. Lovecraft's central horror is often misread as fear of the unknown. But in Dunwich, the real terror is the known being rearranged. Yog-Sothoth is not a mystery in the traditional sense. Armitage knows what it is. The Necronomicon describes it in precise, recursive terms. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate, is the key and guardian of the gate. This triadic phrasing dissolves linear cause and effect. The gate is not opened. The gate is knowing. Thought itself becomes the aperture. The moment one conceives of Yog-Sothoth, the barrier begins to degrade. This leads us to the second principle, epistemological collapse. The Whateley's experiment is not an act of faith. It is an act of application. They are not mystics. They are engineers working with incomprehensible tools. Their ritual is not symbolic. It is mechanical, and that framing changes everything. If reality can be altered by procedure, not by prayer, then the cosmos is not sacred. It is hackable. This is the ultimate heresy in Lovecraft's philosophy. The universe is not protected by moral law, only by complexity. The Whateley's success implies that anyone with sufficient knowledge could replicate their results. That horror spreads laterally into the reader's own world. Consider what Lovecraft does with time in this story. Wilbur ages at an unnatural rate, not as a miracle, but as a misalignment. His body obeys a different temporal logic, not faster, but other. His lifespan is an echo of Yog-Sothoth's own nature, simultaneous, recursive, unconstrained. The invisible twin grows too large for space, too fast for sequence. Its very existence suggests that linear time is an illusion. The barrier that the ritual threatens is not physical, but chronological. The experiment attempts to force a being from all time into local time, and the result is distortion, madness, and echo. This connects to the third concept, dream reality collapse. In Lovecraft's dream cycle stories, the dreamlands are a separate plane. But in Dunwich, that division begins to fail. The Whateley's rites blur waking and dreaming, inner and outer, known and imagined. When the townsfolk hear sounds like a child but not quite, or when voices appear inside their heads, we see the dissolution of perceptual boundaries. The invisible twin is not simply unseen. It is partially conceptual. It exists both within and outside the observer's faculties. In this state, language becomes unreliable, memory distorts, and selfhood degrades. The mind becomes permeable. Humanity, in this framework, is not a privileged observer. It is a temporary configuration, an effect of scale, ignorance, and cultural inertia. The Whateleys understand this. Lavinia, blind but visionary, is the story's tragic seer. She experiences reality not through sight, but through contact. Her son Wilbur is the logical result, a being who sees too much, too quickly, and burns himself out trying to become. He is not evil. He is inevitable. His body cannot hold what he knows. He dies reaching for a text, not because it is cursed, but because it is designed for minds other than human. We must pause here to recognize that the Dunwich Horror introduces a paradox. The more one understands, the more one dissolves. Knowledge, in this system, is not empowering. It is erosive. The experiment's success marks the failure of meaning. Once the ritual begins, symbols cease to refer. The gate is the key. The key is the guardian. Identity collapses. Causality loops. Even the final confrontation, where Armitage and others attempt to banish the being, is not resolution. It is delay. The breach has occurred. The structure still stands, but something is forever altered in its foundation. The Whateleys' ritual is thus not merely a horror set piece. It is a philosophical demonstration. It proves that existence as we know it is not underwritten by order, but by provisional fictions. The experiment doesn't show that gods are real. It shows that we are not. Or rather, that we are real only to the extent that larger, indifferent systems allow it. We will explore those systems, what was actually contacted, and how it functions. Because to understand the catastrophe fully, we must step closer to the entities themselves. And what we find there may not resemble gods at all. To understand the catastrophic nature of the Dunwich experiment, we must confront the entity at its core, not as a character, but as a philosophical force. Yog-Sothoth, named but never fully described, is both participant and medium in the Whateleys' ritual. It is not a god in the classical sense. It does not intervene. It does not punish. It does not act. Rather, it permits. It is the threshold, the condition under which passage becomes possible. In Lovecraft's most infamous formula, Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. The phrase is not metaphor. It is ontological recursion. Yog-Sothoth embodies access itself. This makes it categorically different from other beings in Lovecraft's pantheon. Cthulhu sleeps, dreams, and potentially awakens. Nyarlathotep moves among humans, wearing masks. But Yog-Sothoth is not spatial. It is totality. It exists everywhere and everywhen simultaneously, beyond form, beyond morality. The Whateleys do not summon it in the traditional sense. They intersect with it. The ritual does not bring Yog-Sothoth closer. It makes the participants compliant with its nature. Wilbur Whateley, born of this intersection, is not simply a hybrid creature. He is the first successful interface, a biological construct designed to manifest that which is unmanifestable. His body, his rapid development, his relentless intellectual focus all indicate that he is not driven by instinct, but by embedded purpose. The Necronomicon is not a source of his knowledge. It is his instruction set. He does not read it to understand. He reads it to complete. His failure to fully open the gate is not because the ritual lacks power, but because his physiology, still tethered to mammalian limitation, fractures under the process. But Wilbur is not the true experiment. His twin, the invisible brother, unnamed, vast, echoing across the hills of Dunwich, is the actual endpoint. This being exists out of phase with human perception, manifesting only through indirect evidence. Crushed trees, thunderous footsteps, the unbearable sense of pressure in the air. The local townsfolk describe it not with metaphors, but with failures of speech. It ain't right, ain't natural. Their language collapses because the entity resists cognitive framing. It is not absent. It is misplaced. A being too large for dimension, too simultaneous for time. The story's final horror is not that it is unseen. It is that it speaks with a voice that remembers. I don't like it. I heard it inside my head, like it was talking in my own language, but without words. This moment, barely dramatized, is a rupture. The brother's speech is not sonic. It is cognitive. It bypasses ears, language, even personality. It speaks directly into identity. This being is not an emissary of Yog-Sothoth. It is Yog-Sothoth, localized, partial, inadequate, but real. The experiment succeeded. The entity arrived. It simply couldn't stay. We must now consider the textual force that enables these events. The Necronomicon, often misunderstood as a book of spells, functions here as a ritual technology. It encodes not magic, but ontological instructions, repeating structures that align the human reader with non-human geometries. Lovecraft never transcribes these passages fully. That is intentional. The words themselves are not symbols of meaning. They are keys to configuration. Speech, in this context, is not expressive. It is executable. The fact that this book resides in Miskatonic University's library, available, cataloged, under lock, but not destruction, raises a further implication. Containment is not protection. Knowledge is not forbidden because it is hidden. It is forbidden because it works. The Necronomicon is dangerous not as myth, but as method. Wilbur's theft attempt is not greed. It is necessity. He cannot complete the ritual without accessing more of the algorithm. One final force must be acknowledged: the womb. Lavinia Whateley, often portrayed as victim or pawn, is in fact the critical interface. Without her, Yog-Sothoth cannot touch flesh. Her body is the mediator between conceptual force and biological matter. Her blindness, her social marginalization, her role as caretaker of a decaying household, all contribute to her symbolic function. She is already outside the human order. Her womb becomes a gate. After the birth of the twins, she disappears, literally and metaphorically consumed by the process she enabled. The Armitage Triad, representatives of reason, science, and scholarship, function not as heroes, but as containment technicians. They do not destroy, they delay. Their ritual at the end does not expel the force. It closes the aperture, for now. Lovecraft does not grant them victory. He grants them survival. That distinction is deliberate. So who, or what, are the true entities of the Dunwich Horror? Not Wilbur, not even the invisible twin. The real forces are access, alignment, and inheritance. Yog-Sothoth is simply their embodiment. And what was once opened, however, briefly, can be opened again. We will explore what happens when such forces touch the human mind. Because if entities like these do not break into the world through violence, they do so through perception. And madness, in Lovecraft's world, is not a symptom. It is contact. In the Dunwich Horror, madness is not caused by the event. It is the event, filtered through human cognition. The Whateley's experiment does not merely warp the environment. It distorts the human mind's attempt to contain what it cannot comprehend. In this world, madness is not an affliction, but a consequence of contact. The moment the barrier is breached, through blood, speech, or sight, the human psyche fractures, not because it is weak, but because it was never designed for what it now touches. The story provides several gradations of this cognitive breakdown. At the furthest remove, we find the townspeople, rural, suspicious, and vaguely aware of the Whateley's unnatural practices. Their minds are not corrupted by knowledge, but by proximity. They hear sounds that don't resolve, glimpse shapes that defy naming. Their reports are fragmentary. Something out in the woods, queer doin's up the hill, something walkin' at night. Their language, colloquial and hesitant, reflects the first stage of epistemic erosion, perceptual mismatch. What they experience cannot be translated into their inherited categories, and so the mind recoils into superstition. Lavinia Whateley occupies the next tier. Her madness is not incidental, it is structural. She is blind, yet she sees more than others. She speaks to things unseen. Her role is not that of a possessed medium, but a human aperture. Madness for Lavinia is not a collapse, it is an alignment. She becomes a willing participant in her own dissolution. Her prayers to Yog-Sothoth are not hysterical, they are liturgical. And when she disappears, the narrative does not dramatize her end. It leaves her as she lived, unresolved, suggestively erased. Her mind did not break, it was overwritten. Wilbur represents a different condition altogether. He is not mad, he is madness functionally embodied. His intelligence exceeds his age, but not in a gifted child trope. He knows things he shouldn't, and more importantly, he knows them before he learns them. This preloaded knowledge manifests in his obsession with the Necronomicon. He does not seek power, he seeks completion. His consciousness is directed, fixed, and deteriorating. When he dies, the partial exposure of his body, a human face atop a monstrous form, mirrors his mental condition. His madness is not a deviation from humanity. It is its replacement. We must pause here. Consider Dr. Armitage, Rice, and Morgan, the scholars who investigate the horror and attempt to contain it. On the surface, they represent reason. But their interaction with the Whateley phenomenon reveals a subtler erosion. Armitage speaks with certainty, but his language becomes increasingly apocalyptic. Yog-Sothoth's time is coming. It will burst through. His solution is not scientific method. It is ritual counteraction. This pivot reveals the paradox of Lovecraftian knowledge. The more you understand, the more you must participate. The sane must eventually speak the same words as the mad. Armitage performs the rite not because he believes in magic, but because he no longer has the luxury not to. The story's climax, where the invisible brother speaks, is the ultimate exposure of mind to the unthinkable. The voice does not scream. It whispers in plain language. I heard it inside my head. This is not telepathy. It is cognitive invasion. The voice bypasses perception and installs itself within awareness. The listener does not translate the message. They simply have it. This is the end of interpretive agency. Madness here is not confusion. It is clarity in the wrong key. One understands perfectly what was never meant to be understood. What, then, is the function of madness in this story? It is not moral punishment. It is not dramatic flourish. It is the mechanism of transference. Yog-Sothoth does not strike with thunder. It installs itself. In this cosmology, madness is both symptom and signal, a sign that the known world has been breached. It is proof that the ritual touched something real. This reframes earlier horror tropes. Where traditional Gothic tales show madness as internal rot, heredity, guilt, suppressed trauma, Lovecraft reverses the vector. The corruption comes from outside. The human mind is not the source, it is the surface. And yet, there is an unbearable irony. The Whateleys wanted this contact. Their madness was not descent, but aspiration. They reached beyond comprehension, not because they feared it, but because they desired it. The catastrophe is not that they lost their minds. It is that they willingly offered them. We now turn to the deeper cost, not madness, but what follows it, knowledge. In the next section, we examine the most dangerous aspect of the experiment, the texts, truths, and revelations that were never meant to be recovered. The Whateleys opened the gate. What came through was not a monster, but understanding. In the Dunwich Horror, the ultimate danger is not the invisible being. It is the idea that certain truths exist within reach, and that reaching for them is not only possible, but irreversible. The story's most catastrophic revelation is that forbidden knowledge is not hidden beyond stars or buried beneath oceans. It sits on a shelf, bound in leather, cataloged in a university library. Its danger lies not in its remoteness, but in its availability. The Necronomicon is central to this epistemic breach. Often misunderstood as an ancient spellbook, its function in Dunwich is neither narrative ornament nor a cult MacGuffin. It is a procedural text, a system of encoded rituals and alignments that reconfigure human cognition to accommodate non-human systems. Wilbur's obsession with it is not fanatical, it is programmatic. He is not seeking mystery, he is fulfilling design parameters. He needs the book not to learn, but to complete. Knowledge here does not expand consciousness, it disassembles and replaces it. We must pause here to examine the nature of this forbidden status. Why is the knowledge forbidden? Not because it is false, but because it is true. True in ways that erode the foundational assumptions of perception, time, and selfhood. In Lovecraft's mythos, knowledge is corrosive not because it deceives, but because it strips away the illusions that make human experience coherent. The Whateleys do not go mad because they misunderstood. They go mad because they understood correctly. Armitage's horror is not at the existence of the invisible brother. It is at the logic behind it. The thing that should not be exists precisely because someone read the instructions and followed them successfully. The epistemic collapse begins when Armitage realizes that the boundaries of human knowing were never protective. They were provisional. The gate was never locked. It was simply not yet noticed. This forces us to redefine what knowledge means in the Lovecraftian context. It is not the accumulation of facts. It is alignment. Forbidden knowledge realigns the observer to a structure of reality where the observer no longer holds centrality. You do not learn about Yog-Sothoth. You become part of what it knows. To read the Necronomicon is not to gain insight. It is to be rewritten. Consider Wilbur's final moments. His attempt to access the unabridged Necronomicon fails not because the library protects it, but because his physical form is incompatible with the remaining instructions. He dies trying to bridge the final conceptual gap. His failure is mechanical, not moral. He miscalculates scale, not intent. The invisible twin, however, is the successful expression. It is not a creature. It is knowledge made incarnate, though incomplete. Its presence distorts space, language, and thought. People do not merely see it. They report it imperfectly, with phrases like, "It bent the trees back," or "It sounded like thunder, but walked like a man." These contradictions signal more than fear. They mark a collapse of cognitive framing. The thing does not violate physics. It violates description. Lovecraft constructs horror by creating entities that cannot be diagrammed without contradiction. This is not metaphor, it is methodology. When the being speaks at the climax, its voice manifesting not through ears, but within minds, Lovecraft introduces a final epistemic insult. The voice is articulate, it is not alien. It calls to its father. It recognizes lineage. This familiarity is not comforting, it is annihilating. It suggests that the entity understands us far better than we understand it. Worse, it suggests that our minds are not closed to it. The gate is not just spatial, it is cognitive. The role of academia, the librarians, the rituals, the record-keeping, reveals a secondary collapse. Institutions designed to contain knowledge are forced to use it. Armitage and his team succeed not because they resist the Necronomicon, but because they apply it. This is the final irony. Survival requires participation in the very knowledge that undoes you. The ritual they use to dispel the horror is drawn from the same pages that created it. The only defense against forbidden knowledge is deeper exposure. There is no outside. We must return to Lavinia briefly. Her madness, her prayers, her disappearance, all point to the earliest epistemic breach. She receives knowledge not through reading, but through proximity. Her womb is a vessel not of belief, but of reception. She becomes the first interface, a body overwritten by information it could never process. Her mind is not destroyed, it is bypassed. And here lies the enduring terror. The experiment was not a failure. It worked. A being was born. A voice was heard. The process can be repeated. The knowledge persists. It was shelved, not burned. The epistemic collapse is not a single moment. It is a condition now latent in the system. The ritual need not begin again. It was never truly stopped. We step back to trace the literary roots of these ideas. Before the Necronomicon was named, before Yog-Sothoth emerged, what myths, stories, and cultural threads made this moment thinkable? We now seek the ancestry of rupture, where the cracks first appeared. The catastrophic experiment at the center of the Dunwich Horror did not emerge in isolation. It is the culmination of narrative experiments and mythic fragments Lovecraft had been testing and refining across earlier works. Its power lies not just in what it depicts, but in how it consolidates and rearticulates a network of themes first scattered across the mythos. To understand its literary function, we must trace its lineage backward through stories that flirted with similar ideas, but never enacted them as completely. Dunwich is not the beginning. It is the point of convergence. One of the earliest blueprints for Dunwich's core conceit can be found in The Nameless City, 1921. While not yet invoking Yog-Sothoth or the Necronomicon, this story establishes a critical precedent. A narrator descending into forbidden ruins, encountering remnants of a non-human civilization whose scale and chronology rupture human understanding. It was of no human architecture, Lovecraft writes. Built by what race of beings, or at what epoch I could not tell. Here, architecture functions as conceptual dislocation, preparing the reader for later distortions of space and time. The nameless quality is not about mystery. It's about the failure of language and categorization, an early symptom of what will later become epistemic collapse. In The Festival, 1923, we see the first deliberate fusion of ritual, ancestry, and madness. The narrator, returning to an ancestral town to participate in a shadowy solstice ceremony, discovers a congregation of masked figures descending into catacombs to read from the Necronomicon. The passage, the chant of the priest, was ancient and unintelligible, yet I shuddered as I heard it. signals Lovecraft's move toward linguistic exposure, the sound of knowledge without understanding. Like Wilbur Whateley, the narrator finds himself implicated in a rite that predates his comprehension. This theme, the body as participant before the mind consents, is later echoed in Lavinia Whateley's Fate. The Horror at Red Hook, 1925, introduces the motif of urban occultism and immigrant horror, but more importantly, it experiments with the idea of a ritual system sustained across generations, hidden in plain sight. The character of Robert Suydam, an aged scholar turned cultist, mirrors old Whateley in key ways. Both men collect arcane knowledge, both seek to transcend human limits, and both initiate rituals designed to bridge dimensions. Though Red Hook lacks the clarity of Dunwich, it presents the first test run of Lovecraft's narrative formula: erudition weaponized, ritual as interface, and madness as outcome. It is in The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, that Lovecraft first fully develops the intertextual scaffolding that would support the mythos. The story weaves newspaper clippings, academic reports, diary entries, and archaeological records into a collage of converging terrors. The structure, fragmented, referential, and faux scholarly, becomes the model for the Dunwich Horror's nested narrative. More importantly, Cthulhu's presence is not that of an antagonist. It is a proof, a revelation. We live on a placid island of ignorance, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The being itself does little. Its emergence is catastrophic precisely because it requires no intention. Like Yog-Sothoth, it is not summoned, it is revealed. But it is in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, written 1927, published posthumously, where we find the direct architectural ancestor of the Dunwich Horror. Here, Joseph Curwen, a colonial necromancer, uses ancient texts and genetic lineage to resurrect knowledge through bloodlines. The language is precise. The essential salties of human dust can be so compounded that the resulting creature will remember its past. This idea that memory, knowledge, and consciousness can be transmitted through ritual biology prefigures the Whateley's experiment. Wilbur and his twin are not merely offspring, they are constructed vessels. They do not inherit memory, they manifest it. The reuse of names, terms, and texts across these stories further cements the mythic structure. The Necronomicon, first referenced in The Hound, 1922, appears repeatedly in the Festival, Ward, and Dunwich, each time gaining more specific attributes: forbidden, partial, misused. Yog-Sothoth's earliest named appearance occurs in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, where it is invoked as part of Curwen's rites. But in Dunwich, the entity becomes active, not just sighted. The gate opens, the child is born, the breach occurs. What emerges across these intertextual connections is Lovecraft's growing precision. Early stories gesture toward rupture. The Dunwich Horror enacts it. The earlier tales are archaeological, digging into ancient wrongs, uncovering partial truths. Dunwich is procedural. It is the first story to treat cosmic horror not as accident, but as outcome. The characters do the thing, and the thing happens. This marks a literary maturation in Lovecraft's technique. His horror moves from implication to demonstration, from myth to mechanism, from atmosphere to action. The Dunwich experiment is not just the result of earlier ideas, it is their activation. In the next section, we examine this activation in real time, zooming in on the Dunwich Horror itself to dissect its narrative choices, symbolic structures, and philosophical payload. The catastrophe is not just cosmic, It is literary, and it begins on page 1. While the Dunwich Horror enacts the catastrophic experiment through ritual and blood, the shadow. Out of Time, 1934 to 35, represents the same philosophical rupture through memory and consciousness. The stories differ in tone. Dunwich is gothic and folkloric. Shadow is cerebral and archaeological, but both center on the same destabilizing revelation. Human identity is neither fixed nor sovereign, and knowledge, once accessed, becomes irreversible. If Dunwich opens a gate between dimensions, Shadow opens a gate between minds. The horror is not bodily violation, but epistemic colonization. The story follows Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee, a professor at Miskatonic University who, after a sudden collapse in 1908, begins behaving as someone else, acquiring knowledge he never possessed, speaking in unfamiliar dialects, studying forbidden histories. When he returns to himself 5 years later, he slowly uncovers the terrifying truth. His consciousness had been displaced by an entity of the great race of Yith, a species of hypertemporal intellects who project their minds across time to swap with individuals in other epochs. The Yithians' goal is not domination, but archival preservation. They collect knowledge as a survival mechanism, anticipating the destruction of their species. This premise introduces one of Lovecraft's most radical concepts: cognitive dislocation as historical continuity. The experiment here is not physical, but mental. The Yithians invade not through portals, but through thought itself. This aligns with Yog-Sothoth's nature in Dunwich. Both entities are not invaders, but conditions of access. Just as Yog-Sothoth is the gate, the Yithians use consciousness as the gate. And crucially, neither require physical contact. The medium is awareness. That is the new frontier. The horror in Shadow builds slowly, not from external threat, but from the erosion of epistemic boundaries. Peaslee begins to question the coherence of his own memory. He dreams of vast, non-Euclidean cities, cylindrical libraries, and dialogues with alien beings that he later discovers described in archaeological records. This convergence between dream, memory, and fact is the core mechanic of Lovecraftian terror. When a nightmare proves archaeologically correct, the mind falters. As Peaslee puts it, "What I learned in those years no man ought to know, and I wish I could forget it." This line is more than dramatic regret. It's a metaphysical verdict. Peaslee is not simply traumatized. He is contaminated by knowledge that was never meant to exist in human form. The Yithian experiment, like the Whateleys, succeeds, but its success annihilates the boundary between subjective experience and external truth. Peaslee no longer trusts his own thoughts. Worse, he no longer owns them. His mind is revealed as permeable, a conduit rather than a container. We must pause here to examine the literary structure. Shadow operates as a recovered narrative, framed by academic inquiry. Peaslee's notes, recollections, and archaeological corroborations mimic the structure of the Dunwich Horror, where the supernatural is filtered through scholarly investigation. This formal choice reinforces Lovecraft's central idea that the unimaginable, when wrapped in institutional discourse, becomes more, not less, unsettling. The voice of the university does not protect us. It carries the infection. The story culminates in Peaslee's return to the Australian desert, where he uncovers the ruins of the Yithian city he had only dreamed. The discovery confirms not just the truth of his visions, but their objective existence. The moment is devastating. The horror came when I tried to decipher the faint hieroglyphs on a certain half-effaced cartouche. He finds his own name, proof that his consciousness was there, that memory was never internal, and that reality is, in fact, recorded elsewhere. The mind has no privileged domain. This climax mirrors the moment in Dunwich when the invisible brother speaks intelligibly, recognizing its father. In both stories, the alien being demonstrates awareness of the human. The breach is complete, not through violence, but through mutual recognition. The human mind becomes visible, vulnerable, and altered. These are not invasions, they are alignments. The Ythian project reframes the cosmic horror not as destruction, but as cataloging. There is no moral judgment. Humanity is not punished, merely studied, used, and discarded. This impersonal engagement redefines what horror means in Lovecraft's system. It is not wrathful gods or punishing demons. It is the cold indifference of systems we never knew we were part of. And the experiment succeeds whether we want it to or not. Peasley's fate is not madness in the traditional sense. It is memory without belonging. He remembers things that are not his, but cannot be denied. This epistemic duality, knowing what you cannot have known, is the ultimate form of collapse. It is what Wilbur sought in the Necronomicon. It is what the Necronomicon contains. We return to the ritual, the flesh, the lineage, the hill. The Dunwich Horror is the procedural cousin to the shadow. Out of time's conceptual disruption, one invades the mind, the other invades the world. Both, however, prove the same thesis. We were never alone, never safe, and never sovereign. If the shadow, out of time, reveals the vulnerability of memory, then the thing on the doorstep, 1933, exposes an even more intimate instability, the fragility of the self. Here, Lovecraft shifts the catastrophic experiment from rural ritual and cosmic lineage into the architecture of personality itself. The horror is no longer confined to hills or deserts. It resides within the boundary we most trust, the distinction between I and not I. Consider this carefully. The story is not about possession as folklore imagines it. It is about identity as transferable property. The narrative is delivered through Daniel Upton, recounting the life and deterioration of his friend Edward Darby, a timid scholar who marries the enigmatic Asenath Waite. Darby's decline is gradual but unmistakable. He becomes erratic, secretive, intellectually transformed. His speech patterns change. His handwriting alters. Eventually, Upton observes something profoundly disturbing. Darby seems to host another will entirely. He was not like himself, Upton notes, as if some alien mind had begun to peer through his eyes. The phrasing matters. The alien does not replace, it peers. Consciousness becomes a window rather than a residence. Asenath herself is quickly revealed as the vector of this intrusion, though the truth is more complex. She is the daughter of Ephraim Waite, a sorcerer rumored to have mastered the art of mind transference. The implication unfolds slowly. Ephraim did not merely teach his daughter, he inhabited her. The technique, described obliquely as the projection of consciousness into another body, constitutes a form of ritualized cognitive migration. Unlike the Whateley's biological experiment, this is not heredity, it is occupation. The body becomes a site of tenancy. Lovecraft underscores the procedure with chilling restraint. Darby confesses, "He can take my body, can use it, and leave me somewhere else." The terror lies in the syntax. Calm, declarative, procedural. There is no melodrama because the horror is administrative. Identity is treated like a transferable credential. This is not magic in the theatrical sense. It is methodology, repeatable, teachable, and horrifying precisely because it obeys rules. We must pause here to examine the philosophical shift. In Dunwich, the experiment attempts to bring the cosmic into the human through birth. In Doorstep, the experiment demonstrates that the human is already divisible. The self is not an indivisible core, but a configuration that can be displaced. This reveals something profound. Individuality, often assumed to be the final refuge of autonomy, is structurally fragile. The catastrophe is not death. It is continued existence under foreign authorship. The narrative function of Upton is essential. He represents rational loyalty, yet even he is drawn into complicity. His role mirrors Armitage's in Dunwich, a witness forced into participation. When Darby, now clearly inhabited, begs Upton for protection, the plea is not metaphysical, but logistical. If anything happens to me, you must promise. Promise you'll do what I say. The request culminates in violence, with Upton ultimately shooting the body that houses his friend. The act is framed not as murder, but as containment. Survival requires intervention beyond ordinary ethics. The story's final revelation complicates matters further. A decayed, barely animate Asenath arrives at Upton's door, speaking in Darby's voice. The implication is devastating. Darby's consciousness had been forced into Asenath's deteriorating corpse, while Ephraim continued using Darby's younger body. This recursive exchange suggests a lineage of possession, mind after mind migrating across flesh to evade mortality. Not immortality, but serial habitation. This mechanism connects directly to Lovecraft's broader mythos. Compare Ephraim's technique to the Yithian's mental projections. Both treat consciousness as detachable. Compare it to Yog-Sothoth's total simultaneity. Identity becomes less a singular point than a coordinate within a larger system. These parallels reveal evolution in Lovecraft's thinking. Earlier stories imply cosmic intrusion. Here, intrusion is procedural, almost scholarly. Forbidden knowledge is not shouted in incantations. It is taught. The story also recontextualizes madness. Darby is not irrational. He is displaced. His terror stems from recognizing that his thoughts may no longer originate within him. Madness becomes epistemological uncertainty. Whose mind is this? This differs from Gothic hysteria or inherited degeneration. The collapse comes from external technique, not internal flaw. Lovecraft thus reframes the human mind as porous architecture. Three elements recur across this case study: transfer, continuity, and erasure. Transfer of mind between bodies. Continuity of will across generations. Erasure of the boundary that once defined personhood. Together, they form a triadic structure that echoes the Whateley's experiment: birth, breach, inheritance. The difference is scale. Dunwich threatens the world. Doorstep threatens the self. Yet Lovecraft offers no definitive safeguard. Upton survives, but his testimony is tinged with dread rather than closure. The techniques described have not been destroyed. They have merely been interrupted. An interruption in Lovecraft's universe is never equivalent to prevention. We widen the lens to examine how later writers interpreted and extended these ideas. Because once the possibility of transferable identity enters the mythos, it does not remain contained within a single text. Others would inherit it, refine it, and perhaps, knowingly or not, continue the experiment. Following Lovecraft's death in 1937, the catastrophic experiment of the Dunwich Horror did not remain confined to its original narrative. August Derleth, as Lovecraft's literary executor, began a systematic effort to codify the mythos into a coherent framework, inadvertently reshaping the story's function and philosophical resonance. Derleth's approach reframed Lovecraftian horror within a moralistic, element-based system. Entities were categorized as fire, water, air, and earth, and the cosmic battle between elder gods and old ones was imposed upon previously ambiguous narratives. In this reinterpretation, the Whateley's experiment acquired a teleological dimension. It was no longer merely a proof of possibility, but a potentially inevitable confrontation between cosmic forces. Derleth's revisions illustrate the first significant expansion, moving the story from localized catastrophe toward an intertextual, universe-spanning mythology. Other writers further extended the experimental concept, each emphasizing different dimensions of the original horror. Ramsey Campbell, for instance, in The Plane of Sound, 1975, translates the Whateley's ritual into contemporary Britain, replacing rural New England with suburban decay. The experiment becomes socialized. The horror emerges through communal complicity and unnoticed transformation rather than singular, arcane action. Here, Lovecraft's procedural horror morphs into psychological contagion, suggesting that catastrophe is less about the ritual itself and more about the permeability of human systems. Similarly, Brian Lumley, in his Titus Crow series, interprets Yog-Sothoth and associated forces as manipulable yet incomprehensible technologies, turning the original narrative into a study of applied, forbidden knowledge. The experiment is no longer isolated. It becomes a paradigm for interaction with cosmic forces. Graphic adaptations and modern reinterpretations also demonstrate the experiment's evolution. Alan Moore's Providence, 2015 to 2017, recontextualizes Dunwich in a layered narrative that interweaves historical documents, letters, and marginalia. Wilbur Whateley's actions are reframed as both genealogical and systemic. The ritual is not an anomaly, but a recurrence embedded in human culture. Moore emphasizes the textuality of the experiment, highlighting how knowledge and narrative serve as conduits for cosmic influence. Similarly, the role of the Necronomicon in these adaptations is expanded beyond instruction to a mechanism through which history and story actively reshape perception, effectively turning the text into a narrative experiment itself. The literary consequences of these expansions are significant. Where Lovecraft's original emphasizes a localized breach and its epistemic consequences, later authors render the experiment a template. It becomes a modular concept, biological interface, cognitive invasion, or ritualized procedure, applicable across time, space, and medium. Each reinterpretation preserves core elements, the intersection of human agency with forces beyond comprehension, the destabilization of identity, and the inevitability of collapse, while exploring alternative mechanisms, from psychic contagion to temporal projection. Triadic patterns appear repeatedly: birth, breach, and inheritance, observation, comprehension, and subversion, perception, knowledge, and madness. These expansions also reveal a tension inherent in myth-building. Derleth's moralistic ordering introduces a didactic layer absent from Lovecraft's work, in which cosmic indifference dominates. Campbell and Moore, conversely, return to Lovecraftian ambiguity, emphasizing uncertainty, incomprehensibility, and the operational mechanics of horror. The result is a dynamic literary ecosystem. The catastrophic experiment is simultaneously fixed. Wilbur, Yog-Sothoth, and the Invisible Brother exist as narrative anchors, and fluid, capable of adaptation to new cultural contexts and philosophical inquiries. Finally, the experiment's evolution underscores the enduring appeal of procedural horror. It is not merely the presence of alien entities that terrifies. It is the replicable mechanism, the demonstration that human action, guided by knowledge or desire, can interface with incomprehensible forces. Across these expansions, from Derleth to Moore, the Whateley's experiment becomes a paradigmatic lens for exploring cosmic horror, epistemic collapse, and the structural fragility of human identity. The narrative's adaptability ensures its persistence, allowing successive generations to confront the same catastrophic questions. What happens when knowledge can be executed, when consciousness can be invaded, and when the human mind is a vector for forces it can neither comprehend nor contain? We will explore how these literary developments extend into cultural and psychological afterlife, examining how Lovecraft's experiment reverberates through urban legend, media adaptation, and academic discourse, and how the notion of catastrophic intervention continues to influence contemporary perceptions of knowledge and power. The cultural afterlife of the Dunwich Horror extends far beyond literary scholarship. What began as a localized tale of ritual and anomalous progeny has, over decades, evolved into a web of myths, hoaxes, and claims of real sightings that blur the boundary between fiction and belief. Dunwich itself, while geographically fictional, is often treated in occult and cryptozoological circles as a liminal space, a site where the invisible brother or other Whateley descendants might still manifest. Accounts circulated in zines and online forums describe strange lights on New England hills, odd sounds resembling child and beast simultaneously, and inexplicable physical impressions in remote fields. While these reports are never independently verifiable, their persistence reflects a broader human tendency to anchor uncertainty in place, to transform narrative into collective myth. Urban legend further amplifies the experiment's reach. Tales of rural families practicing forbidden arts or producing unnatural offspring are routinely framed in the language of cautionary folklore. Podcasters and YouTube creators have adapted the Dunwich template, producing serialized readings that claim factual basis, sometimes blending historical New England events with Lovecraftian fiction. These presentations exploit the same epistemic instability central to the original story. The audience is asked to reconcile familiar settings, plausible behaviors, and unexplainable phenomena. The horror is persuasive precisely because it is delivered as semi-documentary. Names, dates, and locations lend verisimilitude, even when the content is fictional. Hoaxes, too, contribute to the mythos. The notorious Dunwich Project of the 1970s, a staged series of alleged Necronomicon discoveries, illustrates how literary material can be converted into performative lore. Participants circulated photocopied pages, inscriptions on field stones, and ritual paraphernalia, presenting them as archaeological evidence. Critics quickly exposed the fabrications, yet the artifacts persisted in local legend. This endurance highlights a recurring pattern. Humans tend to conflate incomplete evidence with existential truth. Just as Lovecraft suggested that forbidden knowledge fractures perception, these hoaxes demonstrate how narrative gaps can become interpreted as proof. The persistence of the Dunwich myth is also fueled by its adaptability. Contemporary cryptid enthusiasts and paranormal investigators draw parallels between the invisible brother and reports of Bigfoot, spectral children, or interdimensional entities. In these interpretations, the story functions less as literature than as template for anomalous expectation. The invisible presence is projected onto any unusual circumstance, footprints, sounds, shadows, inviting a provisional reality in which the catastrophic experiment could be ongoing. Here, the myth achieves something Lovecraft could not explicitly write. It becomes participatory. Readers and observers are complicit simply by looking, listening, or considering. Cultural psychology offers insight into this phenomenon. The Whateley's experiment resonates with universal anxieties: the fear of hereditary corruption, of knowledge beyond comprehension, of unseen forces shaping events. Modern analogs, genetic manipulation, artificial intelligence, global surveillance, mirror these themes, allowing the Dunwich narrative to migrate across contexts. The sightings are less about physical verification than about processing collective anxiety. By attributing ambiguity to specific locations or times, communities externalize uncertainty, creating tangible proxies for incomprehensible forces. Media adaptations reinforce and amplify this cycle. Radio dramas, graphic novels, and immersive horror experiences borrow the template of the invisible experiment, producing reports, maps, and mock eyewitness testimonies. Interactive games, particularly role-playing formats, allow participants to enact the experiment themselves, reinforcing the plausibility of the narrative through simulation. In each case, the original story's epistemic mechanics, fragmentation, indirect observation, partial disclosure, are preserved. The audience becomes a vector of transmission, just as Wilbur's body becomes a vector of Yog-Sothoth's power. The endurance of these myths suggests a more profound function. The story is a cultural proof of the uncanny, a rehearsal of the unthinkable. Its replication across media, hoaxes, and urban legends demonstrates that humans are drawn to experiences that challenge cognitive boundaries without offering resolution. As Lovecraft himself implied, the horror persists when the mind is left to reconcile what cannot be fully explained. Each sighting, whether real, fabricated, or imagined, sustains the experiment conceptually. It is a reminder that the rupture between comprehension and reality is not confined to the page. We will examine how this mythic persistence migrates into film, games, and music, exploring how narrative, audio-visual, and interactive media expand the psychological footprint of the Dunwich experiment, while preserving its structural ambiguity. The horror, in other words, is both amplified and democratized, continuing to unsettle long after the original ritual concluded. The catastrophic experiment of the Dunwich Horror has migrated beyond the page, finding new life in film, games, and music, each medium emphasizing different facets of Lovecraft's conceptual horror. In cinema, the 1970 adaptation, directed by Danielle Haller, translates the narrative into visual and auditory terms, focusing on Wilbur Whateley's grotesque physicality and the invisible twins' presence through sound design. The film's use of off-screen space, ambient noise, and shadowed hills mirrors Lovecraft's literary strategy of negative description, maintaining the tension of unseen but perceptible forces. By presenting horror indirectly, through subtle environmental cues rather than constant exposition, the adaptation preserves the epistemic instability central to the original story. The audience, like the villagers of Dunwich, experiences terror mediated by partial perception, which reinforces the narrative function of uncertainty. Interactive media, particularly role-playing, games such as Call of Cthulhu, Chaosium 1981, and board games like Arkham Horror, Fantasy Flight Games 1987, reinterpret the catastrophic experiment as a procedural system. Players assume the roles of investigators, scholars, or hapless townsfolk, confronting manifestations analogous to Wilbur or the invisible twin. Here, the narrative becomes mechanical, transforming Lovecraft's epistemic collapse into strategic gameplay. Players must track threats, gather knowledge, and manage limited comprehension. The design mirrors the original story's nested structure. Fragmentary clues, unreliable witnesses, and partial truths compel participants to reconcile multiple perspectives simultaneously. The Invisible Brother functions as an algorithmic adversary, reinforcing the notion that catastrophic outcomes are both predictable and inevitable once the rules of the system are engaged. Music, particularly within ambient, metal, and experimental genres, translates the experiment into effective experience. Bands such as Portal and Dark Space employ atonality, dissonance, and spatialized soundscapes to evoke the cognitive and perceptual instability experienced by Dunwich's inhabitants. Wilbur's accelerated intellect, the twins' partial materialization, and the oppressive presence of Yog-Sothoth are rendered sonically as structures that defy rhythmic expectation and harmonic resolution. In these compositions, listeners are subjected to temporal and cognitive distortion, analogous to the literary experience. Disorientation becomes a medium of horror. The music often simulates the invisible intrusion central to the story, creating the sense of forces present but impossible to localize or fully apprehend. These adaptations also highlight the experiment's procedural and replicable nature. In each medium, the narrative becomes a system, a set of rules or mechanics through which the horror unfolds. In film, it is spatial and cinematic logic, angles, sound, editing. In games, it is rule systems and probability. In music, it is sonic structures and temporal manipulation. Each preserves the original story's epistemic function. Audiences and participants are implicated, forced to navigate environments and stimuli they cannot fully comprehend. Just as Wilbur's understanding exceeds his capacity to act, these adaptations confront human perception with events larger than the observer's ability to categorize or contain. Furthermore, these reinterpretations illustrate the myth's flexibility. Video games can transpose Dunwich to contemporary or even futuristic settings without losing the experiment's conceptual impact. Film adaptations often transpose rural isolation into atmospheric urban or suburban equivalents, while music abstracts the narrative entirely, translating horror into cognition and emotion. This migration demonstrates that the story's central mechanism, the interaction between human limitation and cosmic procedure, remains intact even when physical and temporal contexts are altered. The catastrophic experiment, in effect, becomes a portable template for cognitive disruption, adaptable to multiple sensory modalities and interpretive strategies. Crucially, these media reinforce audience complicity. Observers are no longer passive readers. They are players, viewers, or listeners who must negotiate the narrative's incomplete, ambiguous, and fragmentary information. The epistemic instability Lovecraft embedded in the text, partial knowledge, unreliable witnesses, indirect perception, is preserved and amplified. The invisible twin, Yog-Sothoth, and the procedural logic of the Whateley's experiment are no longer confined to literary description. They become interactive, perceptual, and affective experiences. In this way, adaptation itself mirrors the story's themes. Human engagement is a vector, understanding is partial, and catastrophe is structurally inevitable once interaction occurs. We will examine how these adaptations and retellings inform subcultural and academic appropriations, demonstrating how the experiment has been codified, ritualized, and theorized beyond narrative into cultural practice, collective imagination, and scholarly discourse. The myth's psychological and social afterlife extends from perception into practice, illustrating that the experiment's consequences are as cultural as they are cognitive. The catastrophic experiment at the heart of the Dunwich Horror has proven remarkably resilient within both subcultural and academic spheres, where it functions as a framework for exploring boundaries, transgression, and epistemic instability. Within subcultures, particularly those centered on occultism, tabletop gaming, and horror fandom, the story has been adopted as a template for ritualized engagement with the incomprehensible. Online communities frequently reference Dunwich as a site of liminal significance, discussing rituals, cryptic texts, or the invisible twin in a manner that blurs the line between homage and pseudo-archaeology. In these contexts, Wilbur and his brother are not merely narrative figures. They become vectors through which participants experiment with the perception of boundary violation, mental strain, and existential exposure. Participation, even intellectual or symbolic, mirrors the story's thematic principle. Engagement itself constitutes partial complicity. Cryptozoological and paranormal subcultures have similarly integrated the Whateley's experiment into a living mythos. Reports of anomalous sounds in rural New England, unexplained footprints, and flickering lights are often framed as echoes of the invisible brother. While verifiable evidence is absent, these accounts persist because they provide a narrative scaffold for human confrontation with the unknown. The subcultural replication of these stories preserves Lovecraft's epistemic tension. Witnesses are never certain of what they experience, and their observations fragment understanding. This mirrors the story's cognitive mechanics, wherein perception is insufficient to contain comprehension, and knowledge is simultaneously present and inaccessible. Within academic contexts, Dunwich has been appropriated as a case study in narrative epistemology, folkloric transmission, and the philosophy of horror. Scholars in literature and cultural studies treat the Whateley's experiment as an archetype for ritualized knowledge transfer, examining the interplay of heredity, agency, and cosmic indifference. Comparative studies often juxtapose Dunwich with Gothic precedents, such as Shelley's Frankenstein or Machen's The Great God Pan, highlighting the evolution of the controlled experiment gone awry motif into Lovecraft's systematized cosmic framework. Critical attention has focused on epistemic collapse, observing that Lovecraft's work anticipates later post-structuralist discussions of fragmented consciousness and the limits of human categorization. Additionally, Lovecraft's constructed mythos has been a locus for interdisciplinary scholarship. Anthropologists examine the persistence of Dunwich motifs in contemporary folklore, observing the story's migration into oral storytelling, local legend, and participatory media. Psychologists and cognitive scientists analyze the narrative's treatment of memory, identity, and perception, framing Wilbur's accelerated intellect and the invisible twin as allegorical representations of information overload and the human inability to integrate radically unfamiliar stimuli. This scholarly engagement treats the catastrophic experiment as both literary artifact and conceptual model, reinforcing its enduring applicability. Subcultural and academic appropriations converge in their attention to process over resolution. The story is rarely studied or enacted as a closed narrative. Rather, it is treated as a template for thought, experiments, ritual simulation, or structural analysis. The Whateley's actions, Yog-Sothoth's presence, and the invisible twin's ambiguous manifestation are all interpreted as operational motifs, transferable across settings, eras, and theoretical frameworks. This flexibility is central to the story's cultural endurance. It is not bound to Providence, 1928, or even Lovecraft's text. Its logic, the interface of human action with incomprehensible forces, remains instructive and evocative. Importantly, these appropriations preserve Lovecraft's epistemic instability. Subcultural enactments often emphasize uncertainty, incompleteness, and indirect observation. Academic treatments highlight ambiguity and interpretive plurality. Both approaches mirror the story's original mechanics. The experiment is dangerous not because it can be seen or measured, but because it exists at the interface of human cognition and cosmic indifference. Engagement, whether playful, ritualistic, or analytical, reinforces the conceptual after effects. The mind is implicated, perception destabilized, and comprehension permanently challenged. As we consider these patterns, it becomes evident that the story's cultural resonance rests on dual mechanisms: replicability and interpretive openness. Subcultures replicate the experiment symbolically. Academics interrogate its structure and implications. In both cases, the story continues to function as a lens through which humans explore the limits of agency, knowledge, and identity. We will examine how these appropriations coalesce into enduring psychological and philosophical implications, connecting the story's fictional catastrophe to universal anxieties about perception, cognition, and the unknowable. The catastrophic experiment in the Dunwich Horror continues to resonate because it operates simultaneously on psychological, philosophical, and existential planes. Psychologically, it exposes a fundamental tension. Humans perceive themselves as agents within a coherent reality, yet Lovecraft repeatedly demonstrates that this coherence is provisional. The Whateley's ritual, Wilbur's unnatural growth, and the Invisible Brother's semi-material presence all exemplify what cognitive theorists might call boundary erosion, the collapse of distinctions between self and other, mind and world, observer and observed. Madness is not a symptom, but a structural consequence. Comprehension itself induces cognitive instability. Even those who survive, such as Armitage and Rice, are left with altered frameworks for understanding the universe. Knowledge and survival do not coincide. Philosophically, the story engages with enduring questions of human significance. The experiment demonstrates that agency, lineage, and intentionality are provisional when confronted by forces operating on scales beyond human comprehension. Yog-Sothoth is indifferent. It does not reward or punish. The Whateleys act deliberately, yet the consequences of their experiment extend beyond intention. Lovecraft's narrative underscores a central principle of cosmic horror. The universe operates according to logics that humans neither control nor fully perceive, and human action is meaningful only in the context of misunderstanding. The experiment is catastrophic precisely because it exposes human assumptions about causality, morality, and the fixity of self as fragile constructions. The enduring power of this narrative extends into cultural cognition. Folklore, urban legend, and subcultural practices reinterpret the experiment as a template for unseen forces interacting with human systems. Audiences internalize the story as a symbolic exploration of limits. What happens when knowledge surpasses comprehension? When inheritance carries latent catastrophe? When observation invites intrusion? In this sense, Dunwich's horror is metacognitive. It reflects on how humans process uncertainty, complexity, and the unknown, providing a narrative model for confronting systemic incomprehensibility. The invisible brother, ephemeral yet devastating, becomes an allegory for phenomena that exceed cognitive grasp, whether psychological, technological, or social. Philosophically, the story raises questions about identity and continuity. Wilbur and his invisible twin are not only aberrations of biology, they exemplify the permeability of selfhood under extreme conditions. Memory, personality, and consciousness are treated as constructs that can be invaded, overwritten, or replicated. The horror lies not in the supernatural per se, but in realizing that the boundaries we rely on between self and other, subject and object, are contingent. The narrative implies that catastrophic rupture is not an event, but a potential state inherent in existence itself. Finally, the story's longevity reflects a broader human anxiety, our desire to impose order on systems too vast to comprehend. The Whateley's experiment dramatizes a truth that resonates beyond fiction. Technological, genetic, and epistemic frontiers continue to challenge human assumptions, creating contemporary analogues to Lovecraft's scenario. The narrative persists because it externalizes the tension between curiosity and survival, between knowledge and stability. It suggests that attempts to access or manipulate ultimate truths carry consequences that exceed both intent and anticipation. The mind is implicated, the world altered, and comprehension is provisional. In conclusion, the psychological and philosophical impact of the Dunwich Horror endures because it models a catastrophic experiment that is not merely fictional, but conceptual. It demonstrates the fragility of human perception, the permeability of identity, and the provisionality of knowledge. It remains relevant as both allegory and cautionary framework, reflecting universal anxieties about the limits of comprehension, the instability of self, and the enduring unknowability of the forces that shape existence. In this way, the story achieves its ultimate effect. It destabilizes not only the world within its pages, but the cognitive and philosophical frameworks through which we interpret our own.